The fourth quarter numbers are catastrophic, and if we don't stabilize by midnight, we're looking at a hostile takeover by Airline Industries." The words hung in the air of the Elite Airways corporate boardroom like a death sentence. David Mitchell, CEO and founder of Elite Airways, sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his calm exterior masking the storm brewing inside. Around him, 12 board members shifted nervously in their leather chairs, the city lights of Phoenix twinkling 45 floors below through floor-to-ceiling windows. "How catastrophic?" David asked, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around his company. Margaret Foster, the chief financial officer, slid a tablet across the table. "We're down 18% from last year. Customer satisfaction scores are dropping and our competitors are gaining market share every quarter." David studied the numbers, but his concentration broke when his phone buzzed against the table. A text from his daughter Zara lit up the screen. "Flight delayed, but should make it. Can't wait to ring in 2025 together. Dad." A rare smile crossed his face. After months of boardroom battles and corporate crises, seeing his daughter for New Year's Eve was the only thing keeping him sane. Zara was flying in from New York, where she'd been finishing her final semester at the Parsons School of Design. They hadn't seen each other since October, and he'd been looking forward to this reunion for weeks. David Margaret's voice pulled him back to the crisis at hand. "Sorry, continue. The union is threatening strikes if we don't meet their pension demands by January 15th. Marketing is hemorrhaging money on campaigns that aren't working. And now we have reports of customer service complaints rising by 40%. Another buzz. David glanced down discreetly. Another text from Zara gate agent being weird about my ticket. Probably nothing. A chill ran down David's spine. Weird how his daughter was flying first class on his airline with elite status that should guarantee her red carpet treatment. "What could possibly be weird about her ticket, David? We need decisive action," pressed Robert Harrison, the oldest board member and David's former mentor. "Airline Industries is circling like vultures. We need to cut costs, streamline operations, maybe consider merging with a larger carrier." David had built Elite Airways from nothing 15 years ago, starting with 2 planes and a dream of treating every passenger with dignity. The thought of losing his company to corporate raiders made his stomach turn. "We're not selling," David said firmly. "This airline represents something more than profit margins, like what Margaret challenged, because shareholders care about returns, not philosophy." David's phone buzzed again. This time, instead of a text, it was a call. Zara's number flashed on the screen. She never called unless something was seriously wrong. He rejected the call, sending it to voicemail. Whatever was happening at the gate would have to wait 5 more minutes. Like treating people fairly, David continued addressing Margaret's question. Like creating a company culture where dignity matters more than dress codes, where respect isn't earned by the price of your ticket. Several board members exchanged glances. They'd heard David's value speeches before, but tonight with the company bleeding money, his idealism felt out of place. His phone buzzed with another text. "Dad, they won't let me board. Can you call me?" David's blood pressure spiked. His daughter was being denied boarding on his own airline. Every instinct screamed at him to excuse himself and handle this immediately, but the board was watching his every move, waiting for any sign of weakness. "We have until midnight to submit our response to the Valentine proposal," Robert said, checking his watch. "It's already 11:15. We need a decision." David's phone rang again. Zara. This time he couldn't ignore it. "Excuse me for one moment," David said, standing and walking toward the windows. He answered the call, keeping his voice low. Dad Zara's voice was strained, trying to stay composed, but clearly upset. "What's happening, sweetheart?" "The gate agent says my ticket is fake. She's calling security. Dad, I just want to come home." The last sentence hit him like a physical blow. His brilliant, strong daughter, who'd never asked him to use his influence for anything, was scared and asking for help. "Tell me exactly where you are," David said quietly. "Gate A7, Terminal 3, David's terminal, his airline." His employees were humiliating his daughter. "I'll handle this," David said, already walking toward the door. "Don't let them intimidate you. You belong exactly where you are. David Margaret called after him. We need to vote on the Valentine proposal. David paused at the door, looking back at the board members who controlled his company's fate. Then he thought of his daughter alone, and frightened in his own terminal. The vote is postponed, David said. There's something more important I need to handle downstairs. Zara Mitchell stood in the Elite Airways priority boarding lane, clutching her phone and trying to process what had just happened. The terminal buzzed with New Year's Eve. Energy-delayed flights, frustrated travelers, and the constant announcement of last-minute gate changes echoing through the corridors. At 22, Zara had her father's quiet confidence and her late mother's artistic eye. Tonight, she wore a vintage denim jacket covered in hand-sewn patches from her fashion design projects paired with dark jeans and worn sneakers that had carried her through countless late nights in Parsons's design studios. Her natural hair was pulled back in a colorful silk headband she'd designed herself, and her canvas messenger bag was stuffed with sketchbooks and fabric samples. She didn't look like Elite Airways' typical first-class passenger, and she knew it. But she'd earned her spot in that cabin, fair and square with the ticket purchased using her own savings and elite status inherited from her father's employee benefits. The priority lane was nearly empty, just 2 passengers ahead of her, both dressed in expensive suits and carrying designer luggage. Behind the glass partition economy boarding was chaos, incarnate families wrangling crying children, and business travelers shouting into phones and college students dragging overstuffed backpacks. Zara approached the podium, where Victoria Blackwood presided like a runway model who'd wandered into the wrong industry. Victoria was stunning in the way that made people stop and stare, tall blonde wearing a perfectly tailored black Armani suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her makeup was flawless, her jewelry subtle but expensive, and her posture screamed authority. But when Victoria looked up from her computer screen and saw Zara approaching, her expression shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed disgust. Economy boarding begins in 20 minutes, Victoria said without looking at Zara's boarding pass. Her voice was crisp, educated with just enough ice to make the dismissal clear. Please wait in the appropriate area. Zara blinked, taken aback by the immediate assumption. I'm sorry, but I'm first class. Seat 2A. Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose in what looked like amusement rather than surprise. She finally glanced down at the boarding pass Zara was holding, then back up at her outfit with obvious disapproval. Let me see that, Victoria said, extending one manicured hand. Zara handed over her boarding pass, watching as Victoria examined it like a detective studying evidence of a crime. The pass was legitimate. Zara had printed it herself that morning from the Elite Airways app, using her own frequent flyer account. Victoria carried the pass to her scanner, which immediately beeped green and displayed passenger confirmed. Elite status, seat 2A on the screen. Instead of satisfaction, Victoria's face showed annoyance as if the machine had personally betrayed her. There's obviously a system error, Victoria announced loud enough for the other passengers in line to hear. This ticket shows irregularities. What kind of irregularities, Zara asked, keeping her voice calm but feeling her pulse quicken. The scanner just confirmed it. Victoria glanced at the screen, which still clearly displayed Zara's confirmation, then back at Zara, with the look of someone who'd caught a shoplifter red-handed. The system has been glitching all evening, Victoria lied smoothly. Student standby passengers sometimes get upgraded accidentally due to technical issues. We need to verify your actual reservation. I'm not standby, Zara said firmly. I purchased this ticket 3 weeks ago. I have elite status through my father's account. The mention of family connections seemed to irritate Victoria further. In her world, status was something you earned through beauty breeding or business success, not something inherited from parents. Miss, I've been managing this gate for 8 years. I know our elite passengers, and I know when something doesn't add up. Victoria's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Your presentation doesn't match our first-class standards. The word presentation hit like a slap. Zara looked down at her outfit clothes that represented hours of creative work pieces that expressed her personality and artistic vision. To Victoria, they apparently screamed economy class imposter. "Are you saying my clothes disqualify me from a seat I legally purchased?" Zara asked, her voice rising slightly. "I'm saying that Elite Airways maintains certain standards for our premium cabin experience." Victoria replied, her tone growing sharper. "Standards that extend beyond just having a piece of paper." Behind Zara, she heard the shuffling of expensive shoes and the clearing of a throat. She turned to see a distinguished-looking white man in his 50s checking a gold Rolex with obvious impatience. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of boardroom meetings and country club memberships. Victoria's entire demeanor transformed when she saw him. Her smile brightened, her posture straightened, and her voice took on a warm, apologetic tone. "Mr. Preston, so sorry for the delay. We're just resolving a ticketing confusion with this young lady who seems to have ended up in the wrong line." Preston Montgomery III looked at Zara with the same expression he might reserve for someone who'd tracked mud through his mansion. Everything about him screamed old money, from his perfectly tailored navy suit to his Italian leather briefcase to the signet ring that caught the terminal lights. "Look," Miss Preston said, addressing Zara with the patronizing tone of someone explaining traffic rules to a child. "We all have places to be tonight, important places. Why don't you just head back to your actual gate and let the adults board?" The casual dismissal being called anything but an adult when she was 22 and had earned her place here made Zara's cheeks flush with anger. But she'd learned from her father to stay calm under pressure. "I am an adult," Zara said, turning to face Preston fully. "And I paid for this seat just like you did. Probably more actually, since I didn't get a corporate discount." Preston laughed, a sound like barking that carried no humor. "I seriously doubt that. My company paid $6,000 for this seat. You look like someone hoping they'll have extra peanuts in coach." Several other passengers in line chuckled, and Zara felt the familiar sting of being turned into entertainment for people who thought her presence was inherently ridiculous. Victoria seized the moment to regain control. "Miss, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. You're holding up our priority passengers with this misunderstanding." "It's not a misunderstanding," Zara said, pulling out her phone to show the Elite Airways app with her confirmed reservation. "Look, it's right here in the system." But Victoria waved away the phone without looking at it. "Apps can be manipulated, miss. Screenshots can be faked. I need official verification, and until I have it, you cannot board this aircraft." Zara stared at Victoria, realizing she was trapped in a nightmare scenario where facts didn't matter, where her legitimate ticket meant nothing because she didn't look like Victoria's idea of a first-class passenger. "Then verify it," Zara said quietly. "Call your supervisor, check the system, but don't just dismiss me because of what I'm wearing." Victoria's smile was cold and final. "I am the supervisor, and I've made my decision." The standoff between Zara and Victoria had drawn the attention of nearly everyone in the gate area. Passengers looked up from their phones, gate agents from other airlines craned their necks, and even the cleaning staff had slowed their work to watch the drama unfold. Victoria Blackwood stood behind her podium like a fortress, one perfectly manicured hand resting on her computer keyboard, the other holding Zara's boarding pass like evidence in a trial. Her expression radiated the confidence of someone who'd never been successfully challenged by anyone she deemed beneath her station. Miss Victoria said, her voice carrying across the gate area with theatrical clarity, "I've explained the situation multiple times. There's clearly been an error in our booking system that's resulted in your receiving an upgrade you're not entitled to. Rather than continue to argue, why don't you allow me to help you find your actual assigned seat?" Zara felt every eye in the terminal boring into her. A few passengers had their phones out, some recording, others just scrolling through social media, while occasionally glancing up at the free entertainment. "There is no error," Zara said, keeping her voice level despite her growing frustration. "Scan the ticket again, check my frequent flyer number, call the reservations desk, but stop assuming I'm lying just because I don't match your expectations." Preston Montgomery shifted impatiently behind her, making exaggerated sighs and checking his watch with theatrical annoyance. "This is exactly why the world is going to hell," Preston muttered to the woman next to him loud enough for everyone to hear. "Everyone thinks they're entitled to things they haven't earned. No respect for order, no understanding of how society actually works." A few passengers nodded in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Near the windows overlooking the tarmac, Maria Santos sat with her 6-year-old son Diego, both of them dressed in their Sunday best for their flight to visit family in New York. Maria was a night shift nurse at Phoenix General, and this trip represented months of saving and planning. She watched the confrontation with growing unease, recognizing the tone Victoria was using, the same tone she'd heard in hospital administrative offices when she'd tried to advocate for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. "Mommy, why is that lady being mean?" Diego whispered in Spanish. "Shh, mijo," Maria replied, pulling him closer. Sometimes adults forget how to be nice, but even as she tried to shield her son from the ugliness unfolding, Maria felt her own anger building. She'd been on the receiving end of that kind of treatment too many times to count. Victoria, sensing that her audience was growing restless with the delay, decided to escalate. "Miss, I'm going to ask you one final time to step away from this gate. You're disrupting the boarding process for our legitimate first-class passengers." "I am a legitimate first-class passenger," Zara replied, her patience finally fraying. "You scanned my ticket. Your own system confirmed it. What more do you need? I need you to understand your place," Victoria said, the mask of professional courtesy finally slipping to reveal the contempt beneath. The words hung in the air like a slap. Several passengers gasped audibly. Maria Santos stood up from her chair, her maternal instincts overriding her desire to avoid conflict. "Excuse me," Maria called out, her voice cutting through the tension, "but that young woman has been nothing but polite while you've been incredibly rude. If her ticket's scanned, why are you still questioning her?" Victoria turned toward Maria with the look of someone who'd just been addressed by the help. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. Please remain seated and wait for your boarding group." "It concerns me when I see someone being treated unfairly," Maria replied, her voice gaining strength. "I teach my son to stand up for what's right." Preston whirled around to face Maria, his face flushed with irritation. "Maybe you should teach your son about respecting authority and not getting involved in situations that don't involve him." The racist undertone wasn't lost on anyone in the gate area. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably while others pulled out their phones to start recording. Little Diego tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mommy, let's go home." But Maria wasn't backing down now. Years of being dismissed, ignored, and condescended to had reached a boiling point. "My son is learning that silence in the face of injustice is the same as agreement," Maria said firmly. "And I won't teach him to be silent when someone is being treated badly for no good reason." Victoria's composure was beginning to crack. She was used to intimidating people into compliance through sheer force of personality and position, but Maria Santos wasn't backing down. Security Victoria called into her headset. "I need assistance at Gate A7 immediately." The word security sent a chill through the gate area. What had begun as an argument about a boarding pass was now escalating into something much more serious. Zara felt her heart rate spike. She'd seen enough videos online to know how these situations could spiral out of control. "This is ridiculous," she said, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling my father." "Your father can't help you now," Victoria said with satisfaction. "You should have thought about consequences before trying to board a flight with fraudulent documentation." Fraudulent Zara stared at Victoria in disbelief. "You're accusing me of fraud. I'm stating facts," Victoria replied coldly. "You presented documentation that doesn't match your profile, refused to accept correction, and are now disrupting operations. That's fraud and disorderly conduct." Preston nodded approvingly. Finally, someone with backbone. "This generation thinks they can lie and manipulate their way into anything." But not everyone in the gate area agreed. Rebecca Walsh, a third-grade teacher from Phoenix flying to visit her sister in Brooklyn, had been watching the confrontation with growing dismay. She'd seen enough playground bullies to recognize one when she saw it even in a designer's suit. "Excuse me," Rebecca said, standing up and addressing Victoria directly. "I've been sitting here for an hour watching you interact with passengers. You've been polite to everyone who looks like you and hostile to everyone who doesn't. That's not customer service, that's discrimination." Victoria's face flushed red. "Ma'am, I don't know what you think you've observed, but I've observed you making assumptions based on appearance rather than facts." Rebecca interrupted, her teacher voice cutting through Victoria's protest. "That young woman has been respectful throughout this entire interaction while you've been increasingly aggressive and accusatory." More passengers began to murmur among themselves. The tide was turning and Victoria could feel her control slipping. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria announced to the gate area, "I apologize for this disruption. We'll have this resolved momentarily when security arrives to assist with removing disruptive individuals from the boarding area." The threat was clear. Not just Zara, but anyone who supported her could face removal. Maria Santos looked down at her young son, then back at Zara, who was now scrolling through her phone with shaking hands. Diego Maria said quietly, "Remember this moment. Remember that sometimes doing the right thing is scary, but that doesn't mean we don't do it." She walked over to Zara and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Mija, you're not alone in this." Zara looked up from her phone, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Victoria watched this small act of solidarity with growing alarm. If other passengers started actively supporting Zara, the situation could spiral completely out of her control. "Ma'am, please return to your seat immediately," Victoria commanded Maria. "You're interfering with airline security procedures." "I'm supporting a fellow passenger who's being treated unfairly," Maria replied. "And I'm teaching my son that silence in the face of injustice makes you part of the problem." The gate area had become a microcosm of larger social tensions, with clear battle lines drawn between those who supported Victoria's authority and those who recognized her behavior as prejudice dressed up in professional language. And in the middle of it all, Zara Mitchell stood with her phone in her hand, about to make the call that would change everything. Officer Kane arrived at Gate A7 with the swagger of a man who believed his uniform made him right in every situation. At 29, he was built like a former high school football player who'd never quite left the locker room, broad shoulders buzz-cut, and the kind of confidence that came from rarely being questioned. He approached Victoria's podium without even glancing at Zara or the gathered passengers, immediately deferring to the authority figure who'd summoned him. "What's the situation here, ma'am?" Kane asked Victoria, his hand resting casually on his radio. Victoria's relief at having backup was palpable. Her smile returned brighter and more victorious than before. "Officer Kane, thank you for responding so quickly. We have a passenger attempting to board with fraudulent documentation. She's become increasingly agitated and is now disrupting our operations." Kane finally looked at Zara, his eyes taking in her appearance with obvious judgment. Everything about his expression said he'd already decided who was telling the truth. "Miss, I'm going to need to see some identification in your boarding documentation." Kane said, his tone official but already accusatory. Zara handed over her driver's license and boarding pass, her hands steady despite her racing heart. She'd dealt with enough authority figures in her life to know that staying calm was crucial. Kane examined her ID, then the boarding pass, then looked back at Victoria. "What specifically makes you think this is fraudulent?" "The passenger profile doesn't match our first-class demographics," Victoria replied smoothly. "Additionally, she's refused to accept our verification procedures and has become confrontational when questioned about the discrepancy." From his seat in the corner, James Rodriguez had been watching the entire confrontation unfold with growing disgust. At 45, James was a retired military pilot who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan before coming home to work for the Phoenix Fire Department. He'd flown civilian airlines for decades and knew discrimination when he saw it. James stood up slowly, his military bearing evident in every movement. Despite being Hispanic, his years in uniform had taught him how to command respect from other authority figures. Officer James called out, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Before you proceed, you might want to know that I've been recording this entire interaction." Kane spun around to face James, immediately defensive. Sir, this is not your concern. It became my concern the moment I watched that gate agent repeatedly ignore her own computer system's confirmation that this young woman's ticket is legitimate, James replied calmly. He held up his phone, which had been recording for the past 10 minutes. I've got the whole thing. The scan that came up greened the agent's refusal to accept her own system's verification. The escalating hostility towards passengers who spoke up. Victoria's face went pale. In her focus on intimidating Zara, she'd forgotten about the other passengers who might be documenting her behavior. Sir, you need to stop recording immediately, Kane demanded. This is an active security investigation. Actually, officer, I have every right to record in a public space. James replied, his tone respectful but firm. And as a former military pilot with over 20 years of flying experience, I can tell you that what I've witnessed here tonight isn't security protocol. It's harassment. Kane found himself caught between two authority figures, Victoria, who'd called him in, and James, whose military bearing and calm confidence made him difficult to dismiss. Let me see that recording, Kane said, reaching for James's phone. I don't think so, James replied, smoothly pocketing the device. But I'd be happy to provide it to your supervisor along with my formal statement about what I've observed. The mention of supervisors made Kane nervous. He was still young enough in his career that he couldn't afford complaints about mishandling situations. Meanwhile, Rebecca Walsh had been discreetly texting updates to her sister in New York, who worked as a civil rights attorney. Rebecca's sister had immediately advised her to document everything and get other witnesses on record. "Excuse me," Rebecca called out to the growing crowd of passengers. "Is anyone else uncomfortable with what we're witnessing here? Because I think we have a responsibility to speak up." Several passengers shifted nervously, caught between their desire to board their flights and their growing unease about the situation unfolding in front of them. An elderly white man in an expensive suit shook his head disapprovingly. This is exactly what's wrong with society today. No respect for authority, everyone thinking they're a civil rights activist with a cell phone camera. But a young Latina college student stood up from her seat. "I disagree. I think what we're seeing is someone being profiled and discriminated against, and other passengers having the courage to speak up about it." The gate area was now clearly divided into camps, those who supported Victoria's actions and those who recognized them as discriminatory. The tension was palpable, with passengers taking sides and the situation growing more volatile by the minute. Victoria, realizing she was losing control of the narrative, decided to go nuclear. "Officer Kane, I want this woman arrested for attempting to board with fraudulent documentation and for creating a public disturbance," she declared, pointing at Zara. Kane looked uncomfortable. Arresting someone for a boarding pass dispute seemed extreme, especially with multiple witnesses recording and questioning the legitimacy of the complaint. "Ma'am, maybe we should try to resolve this without arrests. Has anyone actually verified whether the ticket is legitimate? I've told you it's fraudulent." Victoria snapped, her professional composure finally cracking. "I don't need to verify anything further. I know our passengers, and she doesn't belong in first class." The mask had finally come off. Victoria's real motivation, her belief that Zara didn't belong, was now clear to everyone in the gate area. James Rodriguez stepped forward again. "Officer, I'd like to go on record as stating that I witnessed this gate agent scan that young woman's boarding pass, observed the system confirm her reservation and elite status, and then watched her deny the validity of her own computer system based solely on her visual assessment of the passenger." Maria Santos, still standing beside Zara, added her voice to the growing chorus of opposition. "I saw the same thing. The machine said green light, confirmed passenger. Everything since then has been about what she's wearing and how she looks." Kane found himself in an impossible position. Multiple credible witnesses were contradicting the complaint that had brought him here, but Victoria was insisting on arrests and removal. "Miss Mitchell Kane," said, addressing Zara directly for the first time, "I need you to step over here with me while we sort this out." "Her name is Mitchell?" James asked sharply. "As in David Mitchell?" Kane paused. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. "You don't know who David Mitchell is?" James continued a note of disbelief in his voice. "The CEO of Elite Airways. The man who owns this airline." The color drained from Victoria's face. She'd been so focused on Zara's appearance that she'd never bothered to look at the name on the boarding pass. Kane looked down at the ID in his hand, reading the name properly for the first time. "Zara Mitchell." "That's right," James said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "And unless I'm very much mistaken, you're about to arrest the CEO's daughter for trying to board her father's airplane." The gate area fell silent except for the constant announcements echoing through the terminal. Victoria stared at Zara with dawning horror, realizing the magnitude of her mistake. Preston Montgomery, who'd been smugly supporting Victoria throughout the confrontation, suddenly looked like he wanted to disappear into his designer luggage. "That's impossible," Victoria whispered. If her father was, she would have said something. Would she? Rebecca Walsh asked pointedly. Or would a decent person expect to be treated with basic respect, regardless of who their father is? Zara looked around at the faces staring at her. Some shocked, some embarrassed, others angry that they'd been manipulated into supporting discrimination. "I never wanted to use my father's name," Zara said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I just wanted to fly home for New Year's Eve. I wanted to be treated like any other passenger who'd paid for a ticket." She pulled out her phone, scrolling to her father's contact information. "But since treating people with dignity apparently requires a permission slip, I guess it's time to make that call." Victoria watched in growing panic as Zara selected her father's number. Everything she'd worked for her position, her authority, her career was about to be destroyed by her own prejudices and poor judgment. "Wait," Victoria said desperately. There's no need to escalate this further. We can resolve this right here." But Zara was done being reasonable with people who'd shown her none in return. Her finger hovered over the call button as she looked around the gate area one more time. "You're right," Zara said to Victoria. "We can resolve this. All you had to do was treat me like a human being." And with that, she pressed call. The phone rang twice before David's familiar voice answered. "Zara, what's happening down there, Dad?" Zara said, her voice finally breaking slightly with relief and exhaustion. "They won't let me board. The gate agent says my ticket is fake, security is here, and they're threatening to arrest me." The gate area had gone completely silent except for the ambient airport noise. Every passenger, every employee, everyone within earshot was straining to hear Zara's side of the conversation. "Tell me exactly what's happening." David's voice was quiet but carried an edge that Zara recognized. It was the voice he used during board meetings when someone had pushed him too far. "The gate agent, Victoria Blackwood, scanned my ticket and it came up confirmed in her system. But she's saying it's fraudulent because I don't look like I belong in first class. She called security, and now Officer Kane wants to arrest me for trying to board with fake documentation." Victoria Blackwood, hearing her name mentioned, felt her stomach drop to her shoes. She could only imagine what was being said on the other end of that phone call. "Are there witnesses?" David asked. "Yes, several passengers have been recording and speaking up for me. A retired pilot named James Rodriguez, a nurse named Maria Santos, and a teacher named Rebecca Walsh. They've all tried to intervene." David processed this information with the rapid-fire efficiency that had made him a successful CEO. His daughter was being humiliated by his own employees in his own terminal, but she'd somehow gained the support of other passengers who were willing to stand up for her. He felt simultaneously furious and proud. "Dad, I'm sorry I had to call you. I know you're in your meeting, but don't apologize." David interrupted firmly. "You should never have to endure this, ever, from anyone, especially not from people who work for me." Victoria was growing increasingly pale as she realized the implications of what was happening. Officer Kane looked confused but nervous, sensing that the situation had just shifted dramatically. "What gate are you at?" David asked. "7 Terminal 3. I'll be right there. In the meantime, don't let them intimidate you any further. You have every right to be exactly where you are. Dad, what about your meeting?" The board will wait," David said with finality. Some things are more important than quarterly reports. Victoria couldn't help herself. She stepped closer to Zara, her voice barely a whisper but audible enough for the phone to pick up. "If you're really David Mitchell's daughter, why didn't you say so?" From the beginning, David's voice came through the phone speaker cold and clear enough for everyone nearby to hear, because in a civilized society, basic human decency shouldn't require a permission slip. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She stepped back from Zara as if she'd been burned. "Is that the gate agent?" David asked. "Yes," Zara replied. "Miss Blackwood, can you hear me?" Victoria felt every eye in the gate area turned toward her. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "I can hear you, Mr. Mitchell." She finally managed her voice barely above a whisper. "Good. I want you to know that this conversation is being recorded. I want you to know that your treatment of my daughter will be reviewed by our board of directors. And I want you to know that your behavior tonight represents everything that's wrong with the culture I've been trying to change at this airline." Victoria's legs felt weak. Her career, her reputation, everything she'd worked for was crumbling in real time. "Mr. Mitchell, I was just following protocol." "No." David's voice cut through her excuse. "You were following your prejudices. There's a difference." Officer Kane shifted uncomfortably, realizing he'd walked into a much bigger situation than he'd bargained for. He was a low-level security officer who just threatened to arrest the CEO's daughter based on the complaint of an employee who was clearly in the wrong. Zara David continued, "I need you to know that what happened tonight is not a reflection of the values this airline is supposed to represent. You deserve better. Every passenger deserves better." James Rodriguez, who'd been watching the entire scene unfold, stepped forward. "Mr. Mitchell, this is James Rodriguez, retired military pilot. I want you to know that your daughter handled herself with remarkable grace under circumstances that would have tested anyone's patience. Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. I'm grateful to you and the other passengers who spoke up. That takes courage." Maria Santos, still standing beside Zara, addressed the phone directly. "Mr. Mitchell, your daughter is a credit to you. She never lost her temper, never tried to use your name to get special treatment. She just wanted to be treated fairly. Thank you, Miss Santos. That means more to me than you know." Preston Montgomery, who'd spent the entire evening supporting Victoria's treatment of Zara, had quietly moved to the far side of the gate area, hoping to distance himself from the unfolding disaster. But Rebecca Walsh had noticed his retreat. "Mr. Mitchell," Rebecca called out, "you should also know that some passengers actively encourage this discriminatory treatment. A man named Preston Montgomery has been particularly vocal in supporting Miss Blackwood's actions." David's voice took on an even harder edge. "Is that so?" And as Mr. Montgomery still in the gate area, Preston felt like he might throw up. He'd gone from smugly supporting what he thought was justified authority to being publicly called out for supporting discrimination against the CEO's daughter. Dad Zara interjected, "I don't want this to be about revenge. I just want it to stop." "It will stop," David promised, "and it will never happen again. Not to you, not to anyone. I'm on my way down now. Give me 5 minutes." The line went dead, leaving the gate area in stunned silence. Victoria Blackwood stood behind her podium like a defendant awaiting sentencing, while Officer Kane tried to figure out how to extract himself from a situation that had gone disastrously wrong. Zara pocketed her phone and looked around at the faces staring at her, some sympathetic, some embarrassed, others hostile. 5 minutes, she said quietly, to no one in particular. This should be interesting. James Rodriguez hadn't planned to become a social media activist when he woke up that morning, but watching injustice unfold in front of him had triggered every protective instinct he'd developed during his years in the military. As soon as Zara ended her phone call, James pulled up his social media accounts and began uploading the video he'd recorded. "This is what discrimination looks like in 2024, he typed as a caption. Elite Airways gate agent denies boarding to legitimate passenger based solely on appearance. Multiple witnesses. System confirms ticket is valid. Agent insists on calling security anyway. This is happening right now at Phoenix Sky Harbor Gate. A7, within 60 seconds of posting the video, had 12 likes and 3 shares. Within 5 minutes, it had over 100 views and was being reshared across multiple platforms. The Phoenix Sky Harbor terminal Wi-Fi was carrying the story faster than any news outlet could pick it up. Rebecca Walsh, inspired by James's direct action, had been live-streaming the confrontation on her Instagram account to her teacher friends. Her follower count wasn't huge, but her network included educators' parents and civil rights activists who knew how to amplify important stories. "This is what we talk about when we discuss everyday racism," Rebecca said into her phone camera. "This young woman has done everything right. She has a valid ticket, elite status, perfect composure under pressure, and she's still being treated like a criminal because she doesn't match someone's stereotype of what a first-class passenger should look like." The comments on her live stream were coming in faster than she could read them, but she caught glimpses of supportive messages mixed with ugly responses that proved her point about why this confrontation mattered. Maria Santos, meanwhile, was texting furiously with her sister Carmen, a social worker who specialized in advocacy for marginalized communities. "Carmen, you wouldn't believe what I'm seeing at the airport right now," Maria typed. "They're trying to arrest a college student for flying while black. I'm scared to get too involved because I have Diego with me, but I can't just stand here and watch this happen." Carmen's response was immediate. "Document everything. Get other witnesses' contact information. This is bigger than one incident, it's about pattern and practice. You're doing the right thing by speaking up." But not all the social media activity was supportive. Preston Montgomery, realizing that his own behavior was being recorded and shared, had started his own narrative campaign from his expensive phone. Watching entitled young people cause chaos at airports, he tweeted from his verified account. "No respect for authority or proper procedures. This is why flying has become such a nightmare. Everyone thinks they deserve special treatment." His tweet gained traction among his followers, mostly other wealthy businessmen who saw the situation through the lens of their own prejudices. But the counter-narrative was growing stronger and faster. Officer Kane was growing increasingly uncomfortable as he watched the situation escalate in real time. His radio crackled with updates from airport security headquarters, where his supervisors were already fielding calls from reporters who'd picked up the viral video. "Kane, what's your status at Gate A7?" came the voice from dispatch. "Situation is evolving," Kane replied carefully. "Multiple witnesses, social media documentation, possible VIP involvement." "VIP involvement, explain." Kane glanced around the gate area where dozens of phone cameras were now openly recording the aftermath of the confrontation. Passenger in question may be related to airline executive. Recommend supervisor response. Victoria Blackwood, meanwhile, was experiencing her worst nightmare in real time. Her phone was buzzing with notifications as her social media accounts were being flooded with comments from people who'd seen the viral videos. Her carefully curated Instagram feed full of fashion photos and luxury travel shots was now dominated by angry comments about her behavior. But the social media storm was just the beginning. In the Elite Airways Operations Center, 3 floors above the gate night shift, managers were scrambling to understand why their airline was suddenly trending on Twitter for all the wrong reasons. "Sir, we've got a situation," the communications manager told his supervisor, holding up his tablet, showing the climbing view counts on multiple videos. "One of our gate agents appears to be denying boarding to a passenger based on appearance, and it's going viral fast." How viral, the supervisor asked, though he was already pulling up the videos on his own device. Approaching 10,000 views and climbing. The hashtag Elite Airways discrimination is starting to trend. The supervisor watched James's video with growing horror, seeing his company's reputation being destroyed in real time by an employee's prejudice and poor judgment. "Get me the gate agent supervisor immediately," he ordered. "And start drafting a statement. We need to get ahead of this before it completely explodes." But it was already too late to get ahead of anything. The story had taken on a life of its own, spreading through networks of activists, journalists, and concerned citizens who recognized the broader implications of what was happening. Back in the gate area, Zara found herself surrounded by a small but growing circle of supporters. James had introduced himself properly and was now coordinating with other passengers to ensure multiple people had documentation of the events. "Have you dealt with anything like this before?" Rebecca asked Zara gently. "Not quite this public," Zara admitted, "but the assumptions, the second-guessing, the way people look at me like I don't belong in certain spaces, that's pretty much constant." Maria Santos nodded knowingly. "It's exhausting, isn't it? Having to prove you deserve to be treated with basic respect." "The worst part," Zara continued, "is that I almost called my dad right at the beginning. I knew one phone call would end this immediately. But I wanted to see if I could be treated fairly on my own merit. You know, I wanted to believe that my father's company was better than this." James looked around the gate area where Victoria was now huddled with Officer Kane in what appeared to be an increasingly desperate conversation. "Your father built something good here," James said. "But good intentions at the top don't automatically translate to good behavior at every level. Sometimes it takes moments like this to expose where the problems really are." Preston Montgomery, who'd been trying to blend into the background, finally approached the group around Zara. His earlier smugness had been replaced by obvious anxiety as he'd watched the viral videos accumulate shares and increasingly critical comments. "Look," Preston said awkwardly, "maybe I was a bit hasty in my judgment earlier. These situations can be confusing." "And no," Rebecca interrupted firmly. "These situations aren't confusing at all. What's confusing is how adults can watch obvious discrimination happening and choose to support it because it doesn't affect them personally." Preston flushed red. "I was just supporting proper procedures." "You were supporting prejudice," Mariah said quietly but firmly. "And now you're trying to distance yourself from it because you realize it's being recorded." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Williams, a tall African-American man in an Elite Airways supervisor's uniform, who approached the group with obvious concern and confusion. "Excuse me," Marcus said, addressing the group generally. "I'm Marcus Williams, Terminal Operations Supervisor. I've been getting reports about a situation here, and I wanted to see if I could help resolve things." Victoria immediately rushed over to Marcus, relief evident on her face. "Marcus, thank God you're here. We have a passenger causing a disturbance, refusing to accept verification procedures, and now she's got other passengers worked up." But Marcus had already seen the viral videos on his phone during his walk to the gate. He looked at Zara, then at Victoria, then at the crowd of passengers with their phones out. "Miss Blackwood," Marcus said carefully, "I need to ask you directly. Did you scan this passenger's boarding pass?" "Well, yes, but..." "And what did the system show?" Victoria hesitated. It showed confirmed, but obviously there was an error. Obviously, Marcus interrupted. "Based on what?" "What specifically indicated an error to you?" Victoria gestured vaguely at Zara. "The passenger profile didn't match our first-class demographics." Marcus stared at Victoria with a mixture of disbelief and recognition. As one of the few African-American supervisors at Elite Airways, he'd fought his own battles with assumptions about who belonged where. "Miss Blackwood," Marcus said slowly, "are you telling me that you ignored a positive scan result because of how the passenger looked?" The question hung in the air like an indictment, and Victoria realized she had no good answer that wouldn't confirm exactly what everyone suspected about her motivations. And, in that moment of terrible silence, the elevator doors at the far end of the terminal opened, and David Mitchell stepped out, his expression calm, but his eyes carrying the promise of consequences that would reshape everything. The executive elevator in the Elite Airways building moved between floors with whisper-quiet efficiency, but to David Mitchell, each floor marker felt like a countdown to an explosion. 45 floors to 44, 44 to 43. Each number brought him closer to a confrontation that would define not just his daughter's experience, but the soul of the company he'd built from nothing. David had left the boardroom without explanation, ignoring the protests of directors who couldn't understand how a family matter could take precedence over a potential hostile takeover. But they'd never been parents. They'd never felt the helpless rage of knowing your child was being humiliated while you sat in meetings discussing profit margins. As the elevator descended, David's phone buzzed with increasingly urgent messages from his communications team. Videos were going viral. Social media was exploding. News outlets were starting to pick up the story. His airline was becoming a symbol of corporate discrimination in real time. But David wasn't thinking about public relations or damage control. He was thinking about the 8-year-old Zara who'd come home from school crying because a teacher had assumed she couldn't afford a field trip. He was thinking about the 16-year-old Zara who'd been followed around department stores by security guards who assumed she was shoplifting. He was thinking about how many times he'd promised her that things would be different when she grew up, that the world was changing, that respect and dignity would eventually be universal rather than privileges granted based on appearance. The elevator passed to the 20th floor. David loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves. He wasn't going down there as a CEO in a suit. He was going as a father whose child needed him. His phone rang. Marcus Williams, his terminal operations supervisor. "Sir, I'm at gate A7 now." Marcus said, his voice tight with concern. "The situation is complex. There are multiple witnesses, social media documentation, and frankly, sir, it appears your daughter has been subjected to clear discriminatory treatment." "How is she?" David asked. "She's handling herself remarkably well, sir. She's got community support from other passengers. But Mr. Mitchell, this isn't just about one incident. This appears to be indicative of larger cultural issues within our terminal operations." David absorbed this information as the elevator passed the 10th floor. He'd suspected there were problems. Passenger complaints had been increasing, particularly from minority customers, but he'd trusted his managers to address issues at their level. Clearly, that trust had been misplaced. "Marcus, I need you to document everything, every person involved, every witness statement, every detail. This ends tonight, but I want a complete record of how it happened." "Already in progress, sir. There's one more thing you should know. The gate agent involved is Victoria Blackwood." David recognized the name. Victoria had been hired 2 years ago based on impressive credentials and strong interview performance. She'd consistently received positive performance reviews and customer service commendations. On paper, she was exactly the kind of employee Elite Airways wanted, representing their brand. "Have you worked with Miss Blackwood before?" David asked. Marcus hesitated. "Yes, sir. And I have to say I've always found her to be selective about which passengers receive her best customer service efforts." The careful phrasing told David everything he needed to know. Marcus was diplomatically confirming that Victoria's behavior tonight wasn't an isolated incident. The elevator reached the ground floor with a soft chime. David stepped out into the marble-floored lobby of the Elite Airways terminal, but instead of heading directly to gate A7, he made a detour to the terminal security office. "I need the surveillance footage from gate A7 for the past hour," David told the night security supervisor, flashing his executive credentials. "Sir, we don't usually—" "This isn't a usual situation," David interrupted. "I need that footage immediately, and I need it preserved for potential legal proceedings." The security supervisor, recognizing both David's authority and the serious tone of his request, quickly pulled up the relevant cameras. David watched in silence as the footage showed the entire confrontation from multiple angles. Victoria's dismissive body language, Zara's patient attempts to comply with requests, the growing involvement of other passengers. "Make copies of everything David ordered. And I want a complete report on any similar incidents involving Miss Blackwood in the past 6 months. Sir, that might take some time to compile." "You have until morning," David said firmly. "This is now my top priority, which means it's your top priority." David left the security office and began walking toward gate A7, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd seen. This wasn't just about his daughter anymore. This was about every passenger who'd been subjected to similar treatment, every family who'd been made to feel unwelcome in his terminals. As he walked through the late-night airport crowds, David passed travelers of every background. Families rushing to catch red-eye flights, business travelers scrolling through phones, college students sleeping across bank seats while waiting for delayed departures. His airline was supposed to serve all of them with equal dignity and respect. Tonight had proved that promise was being broken on his watch. His phone buzzed with another text from Zara. "Dad, please don't make this bigger than it needs to be. I just want to come home." David smiled sadly as he typed back, "Some things need to be big, sweetheart. This is one of them." He rounded the corner toward Gate A7 and could see the crowd gathered around the boarding area. Phone cameras were visible throughout the group, and he could hear animated conversations about rights, respect, and responsibility. His daughter had inadvertently started a conversation that needed to happen. David approached the edge of the crowd where he could observe the situation before revealing himself. He wanted to see how his employees behaved when they thought no one important was watching. He wanted to understand the full scope of what Zara had endured. What he saw made his jaw clench with controlled fury. Victoria Blackwood was still arguing with witnesses, still trying to justify her behavior, still treating Zara like an unwelcome intruder rather than a customer who deserved respect. But he also saw something that filled him with pride. His daughter stood in the center of a group of strangers who'd chosen to support her despite having no obligation to do so. She was handling herself with grace, under pressure maintaining her composure while surrounded by conflict. These passengers, Maria Santos, James Rodriguez, Rebecca Walsh, had risked their own comfort and convenience to stand up for principle. They'd recognized injustice and chosen to act even when silence would have been easier. David took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and stepped forward into the crowd. It was time to remind everyone, his employees, his passengers, and his daughter, what Elite Airways was supposed to stand for. And it was time to prove that when those values were threatened, there would be consequences. The gate area around A7 had transformed into something resembling a town hall, meeting with clear factions emerging and informal leaders organizing their respective sides. What had begun as a simple boarding dispute had evolved into a microcosm of larger social tensions, with each participant forced to choose whether they stood with justice or convenience. James Rodriguez had naturally assumed the role of coordinator for Zara's supporters. His military bearing and calm authority made other passengers gravitate toward his steady presence. He'd spent the past 10 minutes collecting contact information from witnesses and ensuring multiple people had complete video documentation of the events. The key thing, James explained to the growing group of allies, is that we maintain our composure and stick to facts. We've got truth on our side, but the moment anyone loses their temper or gets aggressive, they'll use that to discredit everything we've documented. Rebecca Walsh nodded approvingly. That's exactly what I tell my students about dealing with bullies. Don't give them ammunition to use against you, but don't let them intimidate you into silence either. Maria Santos was keeping one eye on her son Diego, who was fascinated by the drama unfolding around him, and the other on Victoria Blackwood, who seemed to be growing more desperate by the minute. Mija Maria said to Zara, "You've been handling this beautifully. Don't let them make you feel like you're the problem here." But not everyone in the gate area supported Zara's cause. A cluster of passengers had formed around Preston Montgomery, drawn together by their shared discomfort with what they saw as disruptive behavior and disrespect for authority. "This is exactly what's wrong with young people today," complained an elderly white woman with an expensive handbag. "No respect for rules, always ready to cry discrimination when they don't get their way." Preston nodded sagely. "It's the entitlement mentality. Everyone thinks they deserve special treatment, and when they don't get it, they play the victim card and get everyone worked up." A middle-aged businessman in an expensive suit chimed in. "I fly first class regularly, and I've never had problems with the gate agents. Maybe if people dressed appropriately and showed proper respect for procedures, these situations wouldn't arise." Their conversation was loud enough to be overheard by Zara's supporters, creating an uncomfortable tension in the gate area, as two very different narratives competed for dominance. Officer Kane found himself increasingly caught in the middle, realizing that his initial assessment of the situation had been completely wrong. The more he observed the dynamics at play, the more he understood that he'd been manipulated into supporting discriminatory behavior by a gate agent who'd presented him with a biased version of events. Marcus Williams, meanwhile, was conducting his own investigation, quietly interviewing passengers and reviewing documentation. As an African-American supervisor, he understood the delicate balance required to address discrimination complaints while maintaining operational efficiency. But the evidence was overwhelming. Victoria's behavior had been clearly problematic from the beginning. "Miss," Santos Marcus said, approaching Maria with professional courtesy, "could you walk me through what you observed from the beginning?" Maria looked nervously at Diego, who was coloring in a book she'd brought for the flight. "I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but what I saw wasn't right. Ma'am, getting people in trouble isn't the goal here. Understanding what happened is. Your perspective as a witness could be very important." Maria took a deep breath and began recounting the events she'd observed, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. From the moment that young woman approached the counter, the gate agent treated her differently than she treated the other passengers. When the scanner confirmed her ticket, instead of apologizing for the confusion, she doubled down and insisted there must be an error. "And what was your impression of the passenger's behavior throughout this interaction?" "She was polite, patient, and respectful, even when she was being treated badly. She tried every reasonable approach to resolve the situation before it escalated." Marcus nodded, making notes on his tablet. "Thank you. Would you be willing to provide a formal written statement about what you observed? If it helps make sure this doesn't happen to someone else, yes." Rebecca Walsh had been listening to the conversation and stepped forward. "I'd like to provide a statement as well. As an educator, I've been trained to recognize bullying behavior, and what I witnessed tonight was a textbook example of an authority figure abusing their position to target someone they perceived as vulnerable." Victoria Blackwood, overhearing these conversations, felt her panic rising. The narrative was solidifying against her, with multiple credible witnesses documenting behavior that clearly violated company policies. Her attempts to control the situation had only made things worse. She approached Marcus desperately. "Marcus, you know me. You know I'm not discriminatory. This is all being blown out of proportion by passengers who don't understand airline security protocols." Marcus looked at Victoria with a mixture of disappointment and professional obligation. "Victoria, I've been watching the videos that passengers posted. I've talked to witnesses. I've reviewed the boarding documentation. What protocols were you following when you continued to question a passenger after your own system confirmed their reservation?" Victoria fumbled for an answer that would justify her behavior without admitting to the prejudice that had motivated it. "Sometimes the system has errors. I was just being thorough." "Thorough about what, specifically? What additional verification did you attempt before calling security?" The question trapped Victoria because the honest answer that she'd made assumptions based entirely on appearance would confirm everything her critics were saying about her motivations. Meanwhile, Captain Sarah Thompson had arrived at the gate to begin her pre-flight briefings. At 41, Sarah was one of Elite Airways' most experienced pilots, known for her professionalism and calm judgment. She'd been flying commercial aircraft for 15 years and had seen her share of boarding disputes, but the crowd gathered around Gate A7 was unlike anything in her experience. "What's the situation here?" Sarah asked Marcus quietly. "Gate agent denied boarding to a confirmed first-class passenger based on appearance. Multiple witnesses, social media documentation, and unfortunately the passenger in question appears to be David Mitchell's daughter." Sarah's eyebrows shot up. The CEO's daughter and Victoria denied her boarding. "That's correct. And it gets worse, she called airport security and attempted to have the passenger arrested for fraud." Sarah looked around the gate area, taking in the clear divisions among passengers and the obvious tension radiating from Victoria. "Where's the passenger now?" Marcus pointed to Zara, who was standing calmly in the center of her group of supporters, checking her phone for updates from her father. Sarah walked over to introduce herself. "Miss Mitchell, I'm Captain Thompson. I'll be flying you to New York tonight, and I want to apologize for what you've experienced here. This is not how Elite Airways passengers should be treated." "Thank you," Captain Zara replied. "I appreciate that, but I'm hoping this can lead to changes that help other passengers too. I don't want special treatment because of who my father is. I want fair treatment because it's right." Sarah nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right attitude. And I want you to know that from a crew perspective, we take discrimination complaints very seriously. What happened here tonight will not be forgotten or ignored." The conversation was interrupted by Preston Montgomery, who approached the group with obvious agitation. "Captain Thompson, I hope you realize that this entire situation has been manufactured by passengers who are looking for problems where none exist. I've been flying Elite Airways for years, and I've never seen anything like this disruption." Sarah looked at Preston with a professional politeness, masking obvious displeasure. "Sir, I've reviewed the documentation that passengers have provided, and I've spoken with our operations supervisor. What I see is a legitimate passenger who is discriminated against by our staff and then supported by fellow travelers who recognized injustice when they saw it." Preston flushed red. "That's a very politically correct interpretation, but it's the correct interpretation," Sarah interrupted firmly. "And as the pilot in command of this aircraft, I'm responsible for ensuring that all passengers are treated with equal dignity and respect." The exchange was witnessed by dozens of passengers, many of whom were recording on their phones. Preston realized he was being documented supporting discrimination in real time with the pilot publicly contradicting his version of events. But before the situation could escalate further, a new voice cut through the conversation from the edge of the crowd. "Excuse me," the voice said quietly but with unmistakable authority. "I believe there's been some confusion here that needs to be cleared up." Everyone turned toward the source of the voice, and Victoria Blackwood felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. David Mitchell stood at the edge of the crowd, dressed casually in khakis and a button-down shirt, looking like any other traveler. But his presence immediately changed the entire dynamic in the gate area. The CEO had arrived. David Mitchell had been standing on the periphery of the crowd for nearly 10 minutes, watching and listening as the drama unfolded around Gate A7. He'd positioned himself behind a support pillar where he could observe without being immediately recognized, wanting to see how his employees and passengers behaved